Hey guys, so in the last few weeks I have been talking about something that I've discovered through teaching. For those of you who follow along with these videos, and especially if you're my student, I probably sound like a broken record now, but I wanted to share with you guys, I guess, a more personal take on this whole sight-based versus ear-based musician. The main gist of it is that I discovered that there are two kind of very generalized ways of reading music and of playing music. One is sight-based, which is that you have to have a sheet of music in front of you, like actual notated music, for you to play music. You can't do things by ear, or at the very least doing things by ear is ridiculously difficult. You have a hard time memorizing stuff, but sight reading is really easy. On the flip side, if you are ear-based, you may find that it's really difficult to learn a piece of music if you've never heard a recording before. It's easier to learn rhythms if you have heard it done first. And memorizing tends to come very naturally to you. In fact, you tend to practice your music in such a way that you just kind of have it magically memorized without much thought given to it. So I've been making the rounds on my students now, asking them which one they are. And what I've noticed is that people tend to be sort of a mix of both. So maybe rhythm-wise, you're more ear-based, but pitch-wise, you're more sight-based. But I discovered that I am extreme sight-based. Pitch, rhythm, anything music, it's always the best if I have the piece of music in front of me. Doing anything by ear, one, it took the longest time for me to even learn how to do it. Two, I failed my first ear training course in music school. And number three, I have known for a while that I am very relative pitch based rather than perfect pitch based. I've heard concert A enough that I can kind of somewhat pinpoint around where, like, pitch wise that A is, but that's it. If you were to tell me a random pitch, I cannot hear it in my head, like, at all. But if you give me a pitch first and then you tell me to, like, sing a scale from it, I can do that. I can already hear in my head what a major scale would sound like from that note. I could hear what a minor scale would sound like from that note. But in terms of what the actual pitches are, I don't necessarily know. That creates a few problems for someone like me. I am both extreme sight-based and I am extreme relative pitch-based. This discovery within this last 2 weeks has made me completely reevaluate my music school experience. So one thing that I have not actually admitted to you guys before, because I didn't really know what to think of it, and I didn't know how to process what I was doing, so I just never mentioned it until I could figure it out, and I think I figured it out now. I have always been a very bad practicer. As long as I can remember, I've been very bad at it. I've been very bad at practicing. To me, if you put the music in front of me, I can play it. Like, I just look at it and I will do what the page tells me to do. So to me, it's like, well, what's the point of practicing if you can just give me something to look at and I could just read it off? You know, when you're a kid and when you're in high school, I would say that teachers do expect you to practice, but they also kind of understand if you're doing a whole bunch of other extracurricular things too. I kind of practiced and I kind of didn't. I had mostly what my mom would call run-through sessions. You know, if you didn't have a lot of time to practice, then you would just run through your music and then call it a day. She did that mostly just to make sure that we still knew what we were playing, even if we didn't have time to, like, legitimately practice it. I will admit that I kind of abused those run-through sessions, because what I would do is I would do a run-through session first and see if I could play it. And if I could play it with, like, hardly any mistakes, then what's the point of practicing? Heading into music school, though, that's where people really expect you to legitimately practice. So for the first time in my life in music school was when I finally sat my butt down and practiced music for hours at a time. Before, all of my practicing hours at a time wasn't on, like, a piece of music. Like, it wasn't on an etude, it wasn't on, like, orchestral excerpts, it wasn't on a piece of repertoire. If I ever spent hours working on stuff, it was only on tone, so I could spend hours working on tone and not get bored. And it would be technique. So usually more bite-sized technique. If it was any kind of long form technique like Tafno and Gobert type exercises, I didn't necessarily do those really well. But if it was like bite-sized ones like in the Trevor Y, I actually loved them. I would do those all the time because I really liked being able to explore like my fingers, and I love to be able to gain control over my fingers so they would do exactly what I wanted. What I would do is I would apply what I learned about controlling my fingers to when I read music. I can control my fingers to do exactly what I want, even if it feels uncomfortable to me. So for me, it was like, well, I see a point in practicing tone for hours at a time because I'm developing tone. I see a point in practicing technique, like little bite-sized technique, for hours at a time because it helps me learn to control my fingers. But what's the point of practicing a piece of music if I could just read off of it and it's fine? But in music school, they want you to practice. So I tried practicing and something really weird happened. Every time I did practice something, instead of getting better, it would get worse. So I would go into my lesson and play these etudes and orchestral excerpts, repertoire. Let me tell you, it would sound like garbage. It was discouraging. It really sounded like I didn't practice, like even to me. But I did spend hours practicing it. Out of pure desperation, I just stopped practicing. Because what's the point? I'm not proud of this, by the way, but I started to sight read in my lessons. I would sight read my etudes, and I would sight read my orchestral excerpts, and I would sight read my repertoire. By the way, please don't do this in music school. Don't do what I did, okay? I'm just telling you what I did so I can share my experience with you guys. Obviously, there's still mistakes when I sight read, but it really came out a lot better, especially if I put an etude down for a while that I had been practicing. If I put it down for like a week and I didn't look at it and then I just sight read it at the next lesson, it was like actually better. This was like the most mystifying. My teacher would then assume that I did practice, and a lot of the times she would actually end up passing whatever it is I was presenting to her. So my sight reading sounded more like I had practiced than when I actually practiced something. But you know, when this happens to you, it makes it even worse to actually sit down and practice then, right? Because like, really, what's the point of practicing? One of the things that people are the most proud of in music school is how many hours they practice. You know, if you're in music school, you'll know what I'm talking about. Everyone's like, yeah, I practiced 6 hours today, blah, blah, blah. I'm so sore, but this is so great. It's kind of like when people complain about being sore when they go to the gym and work out and stuff like that. You're proud of the amount of work and dedication you've put into this instrument. But for me, because I felt like every time I would practice something, it would get worse, then to me, I almost felt like I couldn't practice. I basically kept it a secret that I was actually sight reading mostly everything. So my sight reading got even better because I was sight reading harder and harder things. You know, every time people were talking about how much they practice, I would just kind of sit there and be like, It was actually very shameful. I felt very guilty for being in music school and not practicing. It was really weird. I've kept that shame, that feeling of shame in me until now. And I've been out of school for a very long time now. It carries over even in my teaching because like I actually still feel guilty telling my students to practice. I guess I feel almost two-faced for telling my students to practice when I don't practice myself. This brings us to what I have now recently discovered. The seed was planted in my head though, so it's not coming from nowhere. I do recall I'd been thinking about this for a long time too. Around my 3rd or 4th year, it was one of these times when people were talking about how much they practice. Someone mentioned, I don't even remember who mentioned it, but someone mentioned that they were like, oh yeah, I practice this so much, I like have it memorized. I didn't even try to memorize it, but I like have it memorized. And I was just like, my piano teacher did teach me how to memorize stuff, and I only ever memorized stuff for piano. She had a very methodical way of memorizing, which was like, you take the music phrase by phrase, you take your phrase, you read it with the intention of memorizing it 5 times in a row without playing it. So you're only reading it silently to yourself. Then you read and play it 5 times again. Then you either close your eyes or you put your music away and you play that same phrase 5 times again. You know, you're gonna make mistakes during those 5 times. It's totally fine. You can check your work. You just gotta keep repeating it until you can do it with your eyes closed or with no music 5 times in a row, no mistakes. I knew how to memorize stuff, but I never made the connection with practicing. Because to me, memorizing was always a separate entity from practicing. Practicing to me was you just drill it over and over again until you kind of like have the, I guess, muscle memory, but I could never create the muscle memory from doing that. I have discovered now that actually the way I read music naturally does not lend itself to building memory. The way I read music is actually how people would learn to sight read music. Reading music and sight reading music, apparently in my head, is exactly the same thing. You know how teachers will tell you to like slash lines in your music for where the beats are, you know, if your rhythm is off or whatever? I actually naturally imagine those slashed lines in there where the beat is. Prior to starting to play, I will kind of feel out how fast I want it to be. Let's say we have the concertino. Okay, so I'm like, now I've gotten a feel of how I want the rhythm to be, right? And then I match the groove that I'm feeling with the slash lines that I read. So okay, right. I'm basically doing karaoke. I see all the slash lines and there's almost like this invisible line just kind of like panning the music as I go. I just play what I see without any thought as to how it actually sounds. Essentially, I'm like those music boxes that you feed little like papers into with all the little holes in it. It just kind of triggers all the mechanisms within the music box to like play whatever you feed into it. That's me. That's why dictation and ear training was always like the bane of my existence, because I am that music box. It's in one ear and out the other. Once you feed the paper in and the paper leaves, I don't remember at all. What I realized then is that when I thought I was practicing music, like when I was like drilling my etudes over and over and over again, and they were just getting worse and worse and worse, it was actually because I was not practicing the etude itself. I was practicing sight reading. When you sight read, what you're actually doing is, on top of like just kind of reading out what's on the page as if you're singing karaoke, you're also kind of predicting what's gonna happen next. It's kind of like when you're reading a novel. If you have to read the novel out loud, you have to kind of predict what the next words are going to be in order for it to flow well. That's why you'll often hear like in class, if you're being told to read out loud, that's why students will have to like restart sentences sometimes, because sometimes you get the inflections wrong. That's what I'm doing in music. If I see the start of a scale here, then I will predict that the rest of the scale will continue. I'm constantly predicting something, but it doesn't mean that my predictions actually line up with what's on the page. If I'm sight reading something, I have less predictions of what's going to happen next because it's my first time reading it. But if it's my like 10th or 15th time reading it, my predictions for what's supposed to happen next are stronger. If they don't line up with what's on the page, every time I'm repeating it and making a mistake and going back and doing it again, I'm practicing overriding what my fingers want to do, but I'm not actually practicing the music itself. I'm only practicing the feeling of overriding my fingers. So in terms of controlling what I want to do in a sight reading situation, I got very good at that, because even if something looked and felt uncomfortable to me, I would still be able to do it. Even if my body didn't want to do it, I would just tell myself to do it and force myself to do it. That is why I started to do soft memorization, which I talked about in I believe 2 videos ago. I'll link the exact time marked section of that video in the info box below if you want to hear how I explained it in that video. The main gist is that instead of like 100% memorizing, I would instead do it like 90%. So I would kind of get to the point where like I could do it once without looking at the page. It's enough for me to actually predict the correct thing instead of predicting the wrong thing and then having to override my predictions. I cannot even tell you how much this has enhanced my practicing, because now I am legitimately practicing the music. I'm learning how to predict things correctly. I'm learning what the notes actually should be, instead of like just kind of playing what I see and not even really listening to what I'm doing. It really forces your ear to turn on. So if you're as sight-based as me, you need to incorporate practice methods that force your ear to turn on. I can literally play music and like completely turn off my ear and like not listen to what I'm playing. It's kind of disconcerting. I finally discovered why I was such a mediocre student in music school, but I could sight read like crazy. I actually want to go back and watch my first sight reading video, how to sight read. I teach it as a sight-based musician. I don't think there's any part of that sight reading video that is truly ear-based. I get it now. Like, I get why, you know, if you're more ear-based, you still wouldn't necessarily understand what I'm talking about in that video. So now I understand why some people kept telling me to listen to recordings. But for me, what I heard musicians playing in the recording, you know, with extra nuances, rubato and stuff like that, it wouldn't match what I see on the page. Basically, I am the metronome. So listening to recordings actually confused me even more when it came to learning rhythms. But now I understand why people tell me that, because they're probably more ear-based in that regard. So they do need to listen to recordings to get a better idea of, you know, what's going on the page. I have had to revamp my teaching style entirely. I have to basically figure out what my students are ear-based in and what they're sight-based in. For ear-based people, I'm like, yes, please use as many recordings as you like to learn the rhythm. But now I have to teach you also how to read it by sight. Now that you know how it goes by sight, and you have all of these lovely interpretations from the recordings that you've listened to, now you can make your own judgment call on how exactly you want to execute the nuances and the rubatos and stuff like that. Different people not only learn differently, different people read music differently. And I made the mistake of teaching with the assumption that everyone read music the same way that I did. So that's why it was always a mystery to me as to why people were often so confused by rhythms. I've never really been confused by rhythms unless they're written very poorly. Typically, if it's edited well, you can see where the beats are. The editor and the composer will actually imply how they want you to feel the beat based on how things are barred together. Usually there's only 2 eighth notes that are barred together at a time, right? Everything that is barred together is equivalent to the duration of 1 beat. Some eighth notes are broken apart because maybe the second eighth note actually lands on the beat, whereas the one before it was off the beat. This happens the most in syncopated rhythms. For a person who's sight-based, it's a lot easier to read it when it's broken up like that, because you can see exactly where the beats are supposed to go. I started to explain this to some of my ear-based students, and they were like, what? We've never seen that before. You just need to find out what you're sight-based in, and therefore employ more ear-based techniques of practicing. And then if you're ear-based, you need to employ more sight-based techniques of reading music. I feel a lot better for having finally figured out what was going on in my head when I was in music school. I do want this to be known, so you guys have kind of like a better context for why my practice with Mies are the way they are. You'll notice that a lot of my practice with Mies are actually just straight up sight reading. I noticed this too, which is kind of like another thing that made me think about this more. Literally now, if I am actually practicing a piece of music, I am making myself memorize it. For now, it's the only way that I've found to turn on my ear. I can tell you it's very hard on me, but ooh, the muscle memory that I build from it is amazing. And like, I play so much better with so much more confidence. Do you know if you are ear-based or sight-based, or if you're a mix of both? Let me know in the comments below. As usual, if you like this video, make sure you give me a big thumbs up, hit subscribe for new videos every Saturday, but please hit the bell icon as well to be actually notified of when I post. I have heard from a few people that they have not gotten notifications from my channel. That's just the YouTube algorithm doing its thing, so hit that bell icon. My last video is playing over here, which I will put a link to up here for you guys. If you want to catch me on my social media, they are listed down below. I also live stream about every other Friday on Patreon, so if you want to join, come on over and hang out. But otherwise, I'll see you guys next week. Bye. Oh, by the way, I'm using my studio lights again because the lighting now at this time of year is just absolutely unpredictable. So I do realize it looks a lot more produced than normal, but I'm still too lazy to put on makeup, so it's all good.